Welcome to Episode 4 of the Power Podcast, presented by Power Magazine and PowerMag.com. This episode of the Power Podcast is sponsored by the Electric Power Conference and Exhibition. 2018 is Electric Power's 20th anniversary. The event will be held at the Gaylord Opryland Convention Center in Nashville, Tennessee, March 19th through the 22nd. The conference offers a great lineup of educational sessions and plenty of opportunities to network with other power industry professionals as attendees peruse the show floor, learning about the latest vendor offerings. Visit 2018.electricpowerexpo.com for more information and to register for the event. Enter discount code PODCAST4 to receive $100 off the registration price. That's PODCAST in all caps and the number 4. I'll be there, so I hope to see you in Nashville, too.
The Power Podcast is the latest offering from the longest-running power industry publication in the world. Established in 1882, the Power brand is dedicated to providing its global audience with news and information important to the power generation industry. Now here's the host of the Power Podcast, Executive Editor Aaron Larson.
Mexico's energy reform began in 2013. It has opened up key parts of the country's electricity sector to new market participants, foreign investors, and innovative technology. Prior to the reform, Mexico operated under a traditional, vertically integrated model with the state-owned Federal Electricity Commission, CFE, responsible for all power supply functions from generation to distribution. The new model is similar to other wholesale electricity markets used around the world. On this episode of the Power Podcast, I'll be speaking with a couple of experts from the law offices of Mayor Brown about how Mexico's deregulation has affected the country. We'll talk a little bit about how the generation mix is evolving and who the players are. Our conversation will touch on project risks and what companies interested in investing in Mexico can do to mitigate those risks. We'll also talk about the financing and who's getting involved in that. To get things started, I'd like to introduce my guests. Joining me first is Jose Valera. Jose is a partner in the Energy Practice Group in the Houston office of Mayor Brown. Can you tell listeners a little bit about your background, Jose?
Yes, thank you, Aaron. I have been practicing law in Houston for over 30 years now, and my practice centers around the development of projects by energy companies in the United States and internationally, but mainly in Latin America. I have also a law degree from Peru, and I work representing energy companies on the electric side and the oil and gas side on project development throughout the region. And I have also worked on a number of LNG import projects, LNG regasification services agreements, development of terminals, and purchase of LNG, representing consumers of LNG, purchasers of LNG that need fuel gas, mainly for power generation.
Okay. And we're also joined today by Kristen Ford. She's a senior associate in the Corporate and Securities Group in the Houston office of Mayor Brown. Kristen, can you give a little background on your experience?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. As Aaron said, I'm in the Corporate and Securities Group here at Mayor Brown. I represent public and private companies and private equity firms and various types of capital markets and M&A transactions, including joint ventures and other various corporate governance matters, mainly in the energy space, but in many different industries as well.
All right. Thanks, Kristen. And today what we're talking about is Mexico and the market deregulation that's happened there. So, Jose, I'd like to start with you and see if you could give a little bit of background on the situation and how deregulation has been going in Mexico.
Sure, happy to. Mexico passed a constitutional reform back in 2013 that essentially what it did was clean the slate of any constitutional restrictions to the participation of the private sector in the oil and gas and the electric industries. And vested in Congress the authority to legislate the engagement of the private sector in both of these industries and to provide all of the terms and conditions related to that. the hydrocarbons reform and the electric industry reform go hand in hand in that the electric industry reform is going to benefit from additional investments that are going to be made due to the hydrocarbons reform in natural gas production in Mexico and the development of infrastructure to store, process, and transport natural gas within Mexico. That is going to provide additional fuel availability for the development of electric generation plants. What the electric industry reform did was first premised on the fact that the monopoly that was existing until this reform had run out in terms of its ability to fulfill the purpose that was intended, in that Mexico was growing economically at a rate that the CFE, the name of the monopoly, was not able to attend sufficiently, and there was unsatisfied energy demand in various parts of Mexico, mainly in relation to large industrial projects. And the capacity, the electric capacity base that the CFE had was not growing, and it was not being renewed. It was inefficient. It was dirty, burning a lot of liquid fuels and coal. And the electric transmission network was congested, inefficient, and not large enough to bring electric energy to all of the areas of Mexico that needed it. So the Congress said this monopoly model has exhausted itself. If we want to truly grow, we need to bring electric energy services, commensurate with the economy that Mexico can be, and for that we need to engage fully the private sector and not depend solely on what the state can do. So this will explain the increasing number of M&A transactions that we're seeing in Mexico. This is the direct result now of the ability that the private industry has to participate in various electric generation and electric transmission projects in the country. We have the legacy utility that has not been privatized and is not scheduled to be privatized. To the extent they sell assets is because under the new administration they choose to do so, but Mexico did not embark otherwise in a privatization effort as part of this opening and deregulation. So you have the old CFE that now is divided into 6 newly created generation affiliates distributed regionally across the country. One affiliate that is going to be the owner and responsible for providing the electric transmission service, and then another affiliate that will provide electricity at the level of retail consumers, those consumers that purchase energy at regulated prices. But what the reform has done is opened up completely who can participate now as an electric generation company, as a power marketing company, and can, under contract with the CFE or with a regulator, participate in the construction and operation and financing of additional transmission facilities and substations. Mexico, at the same time that it enacted the electric industry reform, set a goal for itself of reduction in carbon emissions and a goal for the percentage of overall electric generation that had to originate from renewable resources. In order to incentivize the development of electric generation with renewable resources, this new law created the so-called clean energy certificates. It created the demand and the supply for these certificates and mandated that certain persons must have these certificates, meaning they must acquire the certificates. That is the demand part. So the law says clean energy generated by these companies are going to be receiving 1 clean energy certificate per megawatt hour of clean energy injected into the system, thereby creating the supply for these certificates. And then on the other hand, the law says load serving entities are going to have to purchase these certificates in proportions that the law provides relating to their overall consumption of electricity or purchases of electricity for resale, thereby creating the demand for these certificates. So these certificates have a market value, and they represent an additional source of revenue for renewable generators that helps finance the development of these projects. The law at the same time provides that utility companies, in the sense of companies that sell electric power to retail consumers, that is, they purchase wholesale and resell to retail consumers at regulated prices, must purchase at wholesale their electric energy under competitive terms and conditions, pursuant to auctions that are organized by the regulator. There have been 2 of those auctions so far, and there is going to be a third one next month in this year in Mexico. And pursuant to these auctions, the regulator awards power purchase and sale agreements to renewable electric generators for the sale of capacity, the sale of energy, and the sale of these clean energy certificates to these utility companies. And that has been the main driver for the development of these projects, because under the auction rules, a project company that has not yet built a power plant may participate as a bidder, as a seller, and may be awarded a PPA. And then what happens is that PPA is then taken to the bank for purposes of financing the construction of the facility. The government so far and the industry generally has been surprised pleasantly by the fact that the response of the market has exceeded expectations in terms of clean energy being offered in these auctions relative to the aggregate demand of the utility company. And the prices that have been obtained in the last 2 auctions have been very pleasing to the government because they have been very competitive. And that will now allow the utility company to have a better mix of costs between the cost it will pay for this new energy, the cost it will pay to these under legacy contracts for the continued supply of power to consumers. Overall, the electric generation park in Mexico is being cleaned up. A lot of new gas-fired is being developed. A lot of renewable is being developed. New transmission projects are being also taking place. And even though the electric framework is very young and to some extent still being fashioned, the law is working as intended, bringing significant amounts of capital to improve in the overall electric infrastructure of Mexico. And that now results in all this deal making that we're seeing.
The one question I have is concerning the clean energy certificates. That obviously would be a benefit to renewable projects. Is there any sort of incentive being made for the natural gas-fired facilities, or is that just happening organically?
That's happening organically. There is no special incentive for gas-fired. Gas-fired is being incentivized by the market. The problem that existed in the past, Aaron, was that since only Pemex could produce natural gas in Mexico in the past, together with oil, the CFE was adversely affected by the very limited supply of natural gas it had come into it from Pemex. And CFE had to incur significant costs in developing import infrastructure to bring natural gas from abroad, either by pipeline from the United States or in the form of LNG. And even then, even the very limited transportation infrastructure inside of Mexico to move in Mexico imported gas it resulted in very limited gas-fired development of power generation. Now, with the reform, where anybody with a permit, which is issued upon application, there is no need to bid for them, can develop import infrastructure and transportation and processing and storage. The cost of the gas is going to come down, the availability of the gas is going to go up, and that's going to spur more development.
So I guess you'd expect to see, just like the U.S. has kind of transitioned into much more gas-fired generation, most of the oil-fired generation will probably disappear in Mexico, and more gas will be coming online as we move forward. Is that correct?
That is correct. And to be sure, there are no specific mandates, but it is the expectation that is how the market is going to develop organically, because it is going to be more competitive to generate electricity with natural gas than with fuel oil. And thereby the market itself is going to drive generators, including the CFE, to use more natural gas and less fuel oil, which has a bigger market value for other intended purposes. Remember that Pemex right now doesn't produce enough fuels and refined products to meet domestic demand, and Mexico has to import very significant volumes of refined products and fuels. So if fuel oil can be derived to other uses, it would reduce imports of that commodity at the same time that electric generation is cleaner.
All right. Thanks, Jose. I guess now I'd like to turn to Kristen and have her kind of discuss a little bit about the projects, how risk is mitigated, and who's coming in and who's building these projects. Where is the money coming from? What countries specifically? Are they all coming from the U.S.? Is it internal to Mexico? Or are there other outside sources that are finding this opportunity to be interesting and diving in? Can you tell me more, Kristen?
Sure. Happy to, Aaron. So as Jose mentioned, Mexico has set for itself some pretty aggressive clean energy targets, and the current estimations in order to meet those targets is going to take around $100 billion in investments between solar, wind, and gas in order to meet those targets. So there's definitely quite a bit of investment to be made in the near term. Thus far, it appears as though about $7 billion has been invested so far in wind power. That seems to be the favorite investment thus far among inbound investors. And these, as you mentioned, these folks are coming from the U.S., also from Europe, and also Japan. They're seeing folks from Asia as well investing in these wind farms. So far, it's been about $7 billion to build 42 wind farms. Are the current numbers that we're seeing, and we're kind of expecting that to continue growing. So far, as far as the types of investors and where these funds are coming from, we're seeing really three groups. First being private equity groups that have funds to invest in these projects, and they're looking for something long term that they can put their funds in that will result in a decent return over time, and then will be an attractive selling opportunity for their exit. We're also seeing parties that are perhaps providing debt financing for these projects. The wind power projects are capital intensive. They do require a lot of construction and purchasing the land, and all of this takes a lot of capital in terms of just the industrial equipment that's required, and also just the manpower that's required. So some of the financing parties are providing the bulk of the debt financing. They're seeing interesting equity investments as well. And then lastly, probably most of what we're seeing are industrial and strategic partners that may be involved in the project in other areas. So they're providing perhaps the turbines for the wind farm, and a lot of times an equity investment from the industrial supplier will go hand in hand with the supply of the equipment. The project developers will want to get a good equity deal from their industrial supplier, which is, from the industry side, that's really where a lot of the money is to be made for these strategic partners. And so they go along with an equity investment as well, just to complete the package. And so that the supplier also has some skin in the game to make sure that the project is successful. So depending on sort of which group of investor that is looking at the deal, that's going to really depend on what their risk profile looks like, and the other factor that the risk of these projects sort of relate to is what stage of the project is in. So I'll talk a little bit about both of those things. So, and your ability, I guess, to negotiate risk mitigation provisions in the deal documents, that's going to depend on both of those things as well. So, just to back up a little bit in terms of how these deals are structured, what we're seeing more so than like a full acquisition of a project company, for instance, in Mexico, we're seeing more of what we're seeing are these project companies that they're developers. They've been awarded a PPA in the auctions that Jose had referred to, and then they're developing the project, and outside investors come in for a 50-50 JV or maybe a smaller minority investment. It just depends on the type of deal, but these are mostly JVs that we're seeing at this point. I would imagine that once the market is a bit more mature and a lot of these companies are operating and producing revenue, that we may see a bit more of the more traditional M&A transactions where we're acquiring an entire company as opposed to just entering in for an investment for a JV.
No, that's very interesting. I can understand why some of the suppliers would find it advantageous to get involved in these projects and get their equipment as part of the deal too. So
that's exactly right, and a lot of times those things go hand in hand. So the project company, the developer, will not actually sign up the industrial side, the supply of the equipment, until they get an equity deal that they like. And these projects, depending on what the stage of the project is in, that will depend a lot on the investor coming in, whether they're able to negotiate more protective provisions in the agreements. So if the project is really early stage and maybe they've won a PPA, maybe they haven't even won a PPA, maybe they're gearing up for an auction. At that point, when it's that early, obviously there's quite a bit more risk to the investment than there would be if they've won a PPA, they've closed their debt financing, they've signed up perhaps industrial suppliers and gotten permits. All of these steps along the way, all of these milestones sort of deleverage the project. So for investors looking to negotiate a lot of risk mitigation provisions, it's really in their best interest to the extent they want to be involved in the debt financing conversations, to come in early, and to the extent they want to be aggressive in mitigating some of this risk, they should come in early. And the more time that goes by, the less risky the project is, right? So it builds more value, and at that point, as it goes on, your project company, your developer, may be asking for a premium on the purchase price as it's delevered. So that's an important thing to note in terms of the stage of the project. And really, in terms of counterparty risk, your investor is going to come in and they're going to be buying shares in a project company or buying an equity investment, right? So diligence is always an important step in these investments for the investor, and diligence is extremely important for Mexican deals because Mexico is a civil law jurisdiction. I won't get into too much of the details because I don't want to bore your audience, but there's a concept called sandbagging where essentially if your investor knows about something or should know about something, maybe it's a lawsuit, maybe it's some sort of minor infraction or something. If they know about it before you close your investment, then you cannot come back and try to claim damages kind of after the fact, which sort of makes sense. Mexico, in some U.S. jurisdictions, sandbagging is permitted, and like Delaware, for instance. So U.S. investors that are looking to do these deals should not assume that Delaware sandbagging rules would apply, which would allow you to bring these claims post-closing. In Mexico, the opposite is true. It's very anti-sandbagging. So if you knew about something, or you should have known about something, perhaps there's some sort of detail buried in the data room, and your counterparty can point to the fact that you should have found that before you close the deal. Investors are going to have a really hard time bringing a claim sort of after the fact. So what that gets to is on the front end, doing your diligence and making sure it's documented, so that you in turn have something to prove up what you knew at the time you did the deal. So, of course, law firms like ours and various other consultants are usually engaged to do those exercises. And so just making sure that you have diligence reports and other documentation to back up for your files, in terms of what you knew at the time you made the investment.
So are you saying that a seller could hide potential problems with a project and the buyer is responsible for identifying the issues before making the purchase?
Well, so the important part there is what did the seller disclose, right? So if the seller can prove that they disclosed it to the buyer, then the buyer may be out of luck. That's right. I mean, it depends on the facts, but if the seller disclosed it, maybe in the data room, maybe in in a purchase agreement, a lot of times there's what's known as disclosure schedules, which disclose adverse events like that. So if the seller can prove that they disclosed it to the buyer before they made the investment, then yes. Otherwise, though, if the seller hid something, perhaps from the buyer, or didn't disclose it, then that would be a breach of the representations that are provided in the purchase agreement, and then in that case, then the buyer, yes, would have a post-closing claim. Okay.
So when you go to a court in Mexico, I guess, does it work the same as in America? I mean, are they judges fair and upfront, and everything is kind of operated similarly?
So that's actually a really good point. And so in a lot of these transactions, we have arbitration provisions, because I think the court system in Mexico, while I'm not terribly familiar with it, I know that it's not quite as efficient as the U.S. process. So a lot of times we'll have arbitration provisions in these agreements, so that at least through arbitration, there's sort of international rules and norms in terms of how the process goes. And that can be a bit more protective for your investor than having to go through the court system.
Okay. So are you seeing any utilities, for instance, American utilities, that are interested in getting into the Mexican market?
So one example is Sempra. It's a U.S. company that is interested in the market. And we've had other clients that have asked us just preliminarily kind of what we're seeing in the market down there and what kind of deals are being made. So I think it's, that's really a function of the fact that, we're still pretty early in this process. And so I think once we've had a few more deals announced and more financings announced, and it's, it sort of matures a little bit, we'll see a lot more activity, especially from the U.S. I think, right now, not to get too much into the politics of it, but U.S., it seems like U.S. companies are not particularly bothered by the current political climate in terms of the relationship with Mexico. I think U.S. companies will probably pursue opportunities in Mexico despite any of the noise going on at on the news stations at the political level. But that could be another factor in just between the emerging market and sort of the political tension. As that sort of eases, we'll probably see a lot more activity from U.S. companies. A lot of the investments right now are from European and Japanese companies, actually. So.
Okay. And it's mostly, I guess you'd consider them independent power producers. Is that what you'd say?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks, Kristen, for explaining the process. Now I'd like to talk about the money. Jose, can you tell me who's getting involved in financing these deals?
We are seeing some of these projects, electric generation projects, being financed on a non-recourse basis. The Mexican Development Bank is taking the lead and more bringing commercial banks with it to syndicate and provide financing for the development of these projects. The commercial banking industry is, since these transactions, meaning these PPAs and the participation in electric generation under the new framework in Mexico are new. The banks also need to get comfortable with the risks associated with these projects, and eventually sufficiently so that they can advance financing. And that is also a process that is taking place. And more, probably the Mexican Development Bank is going to reduce its participation to give more space to commercial banks to finance these projects. And as the financing becomes more available, as the banks get more comfortable, that will also be an important factor in the growth of this.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can understand why they might be a little bit risk averse at this point, but as it progresses and moves forward and they get more comfortable, they'd be more willing to lend. So,
right. All
right. Well, thank you, Jose and Kristen. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. And as things develop, maybe we'll get back together again and discuss more on some details that maybe you can share later down the road.
Happy to do so. Thank you for having us.
And with that, the 4th episode of the Power Podcast has come to an end. I hope listeners found my conversation with Jose and Kristen interesting. If you'd like to learn more about Mexico's reform, check out my Speaking of Power column in the September issue of Power Magazine, or visit powermag.com and search Power Market Deregulation Transforms Mexico. I'm Aaron Larson, Executive Editor of Power Magazine. Thanks for listening. I'll be back again soon with another episode of the Power Podcast.